We have written for years about how economic development policy in Kansas City is beholden to developers, developer attorneys, and the organizations they fund. And the EDC, for example, which staffs the various commissions that approve subsidies, is a 501c4 nonprofit organization that is allowed to lobby. And they are funded with fees collected from approved TIFs and subsidies. So we have argued for a long time that that itself is a conflict of interest. They have incentives to say yes and to encourage the city to support these subsidies. In 2015, amidst the collapse of the BNIM, Hellsburg, TIF, and the Crossroads District, the Kansas City Council called for a study of the economic development regime in Kansas City. And that was welcome. It took about 2 years for them to complete a study. And I want to talk a little bit about that study, the process, and the methodology itself. So the city put out an RFP. The council passed ordinances making it very clear that they wanted to understand what aspect of development incentives actually drove successful development in the city, in and around the city. The city posted an RFP. 8 firms responded. The CDFA, the Council for Finance Development Agencies, which is a trade organization of finance agencies, was one of the bidders. Theirs was the highest bid, and they were selected. I think their very participation in the process is itself a conflict of interest. They are the heart of the TIF industrial complex, and asking them to study incentives in Kansas City is analogous to asking the tobacco industry to study the impacts of smoking. As part of their bid, they assembled a team of other companies and individuals. Included in that team was the Hardwick law firm. But Herb Hardwick staffs the TIF Commission. He is counsel to the TIF Commission. That is a dramatic conflict of interest, and one wonders how Hardwick allowed himself to be a partner on a study of an agency he staffed. The good news from the CDFA's initial team was that it included the W.E. Upjohn Institute of Employment Research, which has published several studies on incentives in 2017 and 2018 most notably, and concluded that subsidies do very little to actually drive development, that the money is wasted. In their 2018 study, they said that about 75% of incentivized firms would have done the action they were incentivized to do even without the incentive. But between CDFA's submission and the actual contract, Upjohn was dropped from the study, and they were replaced with REMI, which is a development analysis firm which supports the Economic Development Corporation of Kansas City already. So again, another conflict is introduced. And their methodology seems to merely look at development that happened after a subsidy is given and assume that all that development is because of the subsidy. Again, that is not serious scholarship. That is superstition. That is why baseball players don't change their socks or shave their beard, because they think that that action supports their winning. There's no research to indicate that. And unfortunately, because of REMI's involvement, the CDFA study to the city never actually met the mandate of the council, which was to figure out what part of incentives, or if incentives at all, actually drove development. When the study was issued in August 16 of 2018, council members were already skeptical. I think the Star had published a piece that morning about how the CDFA was supported by lobbyists and developers and developer attorneys. And if you look back at the business meeting, council members asked very pointed questions of the CDFA team, who admitted time and again that they could not answer the questions because the methodology simply did not look at whether or not the incentives drove development, and this was very frustrating. Over the next few months, and through a number of open records requests of the city and the EDC, I discovered that it certainly appears that the EDC and the development financiers in Kansas City made every effort to designed the study to meet preordained conclusions. In one email, which I detail in the report, and I have copies here for you, a development financier writes to the head of the EDC, "This study needs to protect us against citizen petitioners and the KC Library, two of the biggest opponents of economic development subsidies." That email went from the head of the EDC to the woman overseeing the study for the city, and was forwarded on the person who authored the study by CDFA. And certainly that's exactly what the report did. It concluded, incredibly, that every incentive dollar sees an almost multiple of $4 return. And that is not supported by any research anywhere else in the United States on incentives. And it is very frustrating that the city spent $350,000 on a study that appears to have been preordained to reach conclusions that support existing policy. We call on the city council to have the city auditor look into this study to see if proper procurement procedures were followed, to see if private outside interests exerted undue influence on the study. We call on the city council to retract this study. We call on the city council to issue a legitimate, independent, and transparent study of economic and development incentives. One of the things I talk about in the report is that 10%, over 10% of the CDFA study was set aside for public relations and government relations firms. Why? The Show Me Institute hires outside people to do research for us all the time. If any of them said, "I want to have a PR firm as part of my project," we would laugh them out of the room. Your researcher, provide us the data and your methodology and your conclusions, and we'll take care of it. But this study that the city released last year appears to have been just a public relations effort. And the fact that there was a PR firm on the team, and the fact that they changed team members just supports that. So this is outrageous, and it's disappointing. Everybody in Kansas City wants a growing, thriving, economically successful city. I love Kansas City. Not every decision that we make is a good one, and I think the people of Kansas City deserve a real effort to find out what policies work and what policies don't work. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
In that study, Patrick, you're very critical of it, but there are parts of that study that are also very critical of the process. I mean, it's not a whitewash.
So, the parts of the study that are valuable is they point out that the city does a very sloppy job, or no job at all, of tallying up the various incentives and the impacts of them. And certainly that is valuable. The city can do a much better job of collecting information from the various counties and things like that. But it skirts the most important question, which is, are the incentives themselves driving development? So, for example, Kansas City has seen an awful lot of economic improvement, but how much of that is simply due to the improving economy? We don't know. And if we are going to continue to incentivize developers, we ought to know to what degree that incentive is contributing to the success. You know, the famous line from John Wanamaker is, "I know that 50% of my advertising budget is wasted, I just don't know which 50%. So in Kansas City, it may be that 75% of our incentives are wasted. We ought to know which 75.
Are you saying that the people in the economic development community put their thumb on the scale on this report?
That appears to be the case. They explicitly wrote emails saying that this study needs to protect economic development regime against citizen petitioners and the KC Library and the taxing jurisdictions. And as evidence of that, in a Chamber of Commerce draft document opposing the June question 1 on the 50% cap, they cited this report. So it would appear that the intention was to use the report as a club against reform. We see the methodology, reach those conclusions, and then we see a use of the report as a club against incentives.
Over the course of the study, was it just the EDC that was overseeing how it was run, or were there city officials also involved, periodically throughout the process?
So we haven't covered a number. So the EDC wasn't running the study.
Right.
A member of the city council was, or a member of the city staff was. But clearly, she was in regular contact with a number of stakeholders, now including the taxing jurisdictions. But we've uncovered emails where drafts of the report are shared widely throughout the city and the EDC. And there's even one document which I'll share with you guys online that shows kind of, it's a spreadsheet of meetings that are being held with stakeholders. And you see that developers and their representatives are met with regularly, and then you see all the taxing jurisdictions and there are just no ongoing meetings. So I think what the city did was, some stakeholders were worth more to them than others. And so they all kind of managed this study. In fact, if you look at the Kansas City's 2018 annual report, they described the study as the city orchestrated a study. And that's a particularly interesting word because it suggests that they had a conclusion already in mind and designed the methodology. Right. But it is not, so for example, what a truly independent study would look like is the city would hire somebody, give them all the data that they asked for, and then say, come back in 6 months with your report. But that's not what happened here. The city was constantly editing and involved and passing it around to developers and their representatives. And so the final report ends up with this kind of raw conclusion, even though it says we don't do a very good job of collecting data.
And why bring attention and make these calls to the city council now? Is it in response to the election that's coming up and the ballot question that'll be on the ballot?
So certainly the election is an opportunity to draw people's attention to this, but it took months to get responses to some of these records requests. We could have been able to conclude this an awful long time ago, but the city kind of going through, in some cases, record requests that included 14,000 emails that we had asked for. So I understand there was time for that. But what is frustrating is seeing the chamber document that cites this survey, knowing that the city kind of went around in a dog and pony show unveiling this report. And part of what got under my skin is the recent discovery that we are overbuilding hotels downtown. And it seems to me that everything that we do in Kansas City on economic development is just transactional. We just look at the deal in front of us. And there's no kind of big picture interest in what are the long-term impacts or what are, is this working policy-wise? It's just come and ask for money and we'll give you money.
I think over the course of this election and in context of the mayoral race, there's been a lot more discussion and maybe critical discussion about the use of incentives in the city. Do you think that the candidates for mayor are hearing that message or are paying attention?
So I certainly think they hear that people aren't happy with the regime. I wanted to point out that even the data they may be using to assess the practice is itself questionable. All we know is that we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on this, and we think we're getting something, but we're not quite sure. And we conducted a study which told us we had a fourfold return, and I think it's all garbage. And I want people to understand that we simply don't know if any of this is working, and the study that was supposed to tell us that didn't even make an effort.
Do you see a place, Patrick, for incentives?
So that's a great question, and the short answer is I don't know. The idea is compelling, which is government policy says, hey, there's a part of town that we really want to incentivize construction in, and that sounds reasonable. And kind of reducing the risk by some sort of subsidy or even abatement seems reasonable. But the problem is in Missouri, the standards for granting those are so low that everybody gets it. And so the data is really dirty. When you look at it in the aggregate, you find that TIF does nothing in the aggregate to increase development. Now, it may be that one or two projects that the city incentivizes are actually success stories. But because our data is so bad, we can't tell the 2 good ones from the 10 bad ones until after the fact when it's too late. There are subsidies that the library has voted for, that the school district has voted for, that they look at and say this is a worthwhile effort to divert our property tax. But policymakers like the council really have no tools other than the promises of developers and kind of the hoopla to determine good from bad. And that's really a problem. So again, my short answer is no, it appears that none of them look good. They may, but we really have to tighten up our research so that we can say, you know, for example, if we tightened up what blight meant, if we tightened up what, parts of town were eligible for these and the types of subsidies we gave, it may be in 10 years that the data concludes, oh yeah, actually when this stuff is applied, it does work. But until we actually put teeth into these standards, we just give it to anybody. And if you're a developer, frankly, you'd be a fool not to ask for them because everybody gets them.
That's all I have.
I got it.
Ars, thank you so much. I'm grateful for your time.